17 drones, no warning, no declaration, and by morning oil markets had moved more than they did on the day Russia invaded Ukraine. Who gave the launch order and why that night? Why did the USS Gerald Ford sit 400 miles away and do nothing? What does Iran know about the next 96 hours that Washington isn't saying publicly? The official story says this was a measured provocation, but measured by whose clock? Because three things happened in the 48 hours before those drones launched that the mainstream coverage skipped entirely, and each one points to something far more calculated than a rogue military action. Who gave the launch order and why that night? Why did the USS Gerald Ford sit 400 miles away and do nothing? And what does Iran know about the next 96 hours that Washington isn't saying publicly? Here's the board as it actually stands. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the chokehold through which 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves every single day. Iran doesn't need to sink a ship to weaponize it. They just need to make the insurance companies nervous. And right now, Lloyd's of London war risk premiums for tankers transiting that corridor have tripled in 6 weeks. Triple, not doubled, tripled. That means companies are already pricing in a conflict that hasn't officially started, and someone knew those drones were coming before the markets opened. We'll get to that. But first, let's understand exactly why this specific night, this specific target, and this specific number 17 is not an accident. To understand what Iran just did, you have to understand what Iran has spent the last 4 years quietly building. After the 2019 Abqaiq strikes, when Iranian-linked forces hit the heart of Saudi Aramco's processing infrastructure and briefly knocked out 5% of global oil supply, most Western analysts wrote the response off as a one-time shock, a warning flare, move on. Iran was watching that reaction very carefully. What they saw was this: the United States made noise. Saudi Arabia made noise. Oil spiked $15 in a single session, and then nothing. No military response, no coalition, no red line enforced, just noise, then silence, then normalization. That silence was a green light, not immediately, slowly, methodically, over the next 36 months. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, restructured its entire drone warfare doctrine around one core insight. Precision disruption costs almost nothing to execute. The economic response costs the West far more than the attack itself. Think about what that means strategically. A Shahed 136 loitering munition, the same platform used in the Ukraine theater, costs Iran approximately $20,000 to produce per unit, 17 of them, $340,000. The oil market swing triggered overnight. $8.3 per barrel, multiplied across global daily consumption of 100 million barrels, that's $830 million in value transferred in a single night. $340,000 in $830 million moved. That's not a military operation. That's a financial weapon wearing a military uniform. But here's where the story breaks from what you've been told. The target of those 17 drones was not primarily a military installation. Yes, there was infrastructure hit. Yes, there were casualties reported, 3 confirmed, the number almost certainly higher given the location's sensitivity. But the real target was a junction point, a coordination node that sits between two things Iran needs disrupted simultaneously: U.S. forward deployment logistics in the northern Arabian Gulf, and the signal it sends to the Houthis, Hezbollah, and the popular mobilization forces in Iraq that the axis of resistance is still operational, still coordinated, still willing to move first. Why does the timing connect to a back-channel negotiation that was 11 days from completion? That loop stays open for now. Remember it. Here is the problem the United States now faces, and it's not the problem being described on television. The U.S. has significant air and naval assets in the region: the Carrier Strike Group, forward-deployed destroyers, the base infrastructure at Al Udeid in Qatar, Diego Garcia further south. On paper, the conventional military advantage is not even close. U.S. Central Command has strike options that could, within hours, degrade 40% of Iran's operational drone production capacity. But here's what that option actually costs. The moment a U.S. strike hits Iranian soil, not a proxy, not a forward position, Iranian soil, the Strait of Hormuz closes, not symbolically, physically. Iran has spent a decade pre-positioning anti-ship missile batteries, fast attack craft, and underwater mine capabilities specifically to execute a 3 to 5 day closure of that corridor, they don't need to hold it forever, they just need to hold it long enough for oil to hit $140 a barrel. At $140 oil, the U.S. economy, which is already navigating a politically fragile moment, faces cascading pressure. Fuel costs, supply chain repricing, inflation re-acceleration. Iran's calculation is brutal and simple. The cost of retaliation is higher for Washington than the cost of absorbing the drone strike, and they've modeled this precisely. We know this because of an IRGC strategic document partially translated and published by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in 2022 that explicitly frames economic disruption through energy market manipulation as Iran's primary asymmetric lever against us strategic reach. This isn't improvisation, it's doctrine. Now, the detail that changes everything: 11 days before those 17 drones launched, 11 days, a back-channel negotiation was in its final stages. Not a nuclear deal, not a prisoner exchange, something more specific and more dangerous to certain regional actors, a quiet agreement brokered through Omani intermediaries. That would have seen the IRGC's designation as a foreign terrorist organization suspended, not removed, suspended for a 90-day window in exchange for a verifiable pause on proxy escalation across 3 theaters simultaneously: Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon. 90 days, 3 theaters, 1 suspension. It was 11 days from being signed. And then the drones launched. The question intelligence analysts are now asking behind closed doors isn't whether Iran broke the deal, it's who inside Iran needed the deal broken and why. Because the Supreme Leader's office and the IRGC do not always want the same thing. The diplomatic track serves Khamenei's long game. The escalation track serves the IRGC's institutional survival, its budget, its regional influence, its justification for existing at the scale it currently operates. This is why the launch order matters more than the launch itself. The Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group. Here is the number that nobody is explaining properly: 400 miles. At the time of the drone strikes, the carrier was operating approximately 400 nautical miles from the engagement zone, a positioning decision made 72 hours earlier, ostensibly 4 scheduled exercises, but 400 miles is meaningful. It puts the carrier outside the optimal response window for close air support, and this is the part that matters, it keeps it outside the primary engagement envelope of Iran's College Fars anti-ship ballistic missile. That missile has a documented range of 300 kilometers. The carrier sat 740 kilometers away. So the question is, was that carrier moved back to protect it or to avoid forcing Iran's hand? Because those are 2 completely different strategic logics. If you move it back to protect it, you're assuming Iran might escalate to a carrier targeting event. That's a war calculation. If you move it back to avoid forcing their hand, you're managing escalation, trying to preserve the negotiating window. That's a diplomacy calculation. Both can be true simultaneously, and the fact that we don't know which one drove that decision tells you exactly how narrow the current decision space actually is. In the 96 hours following the drone strikes, 3 things happened that received almost no coverage. First, Iran's foreign minister made a public statement using a specific phrase, defensive equilibrium, that IRGC doctrine uses to signal that an operation was authorized at the highest level and is considered complete, not a prelude. Second, crude futures didn't retreat after the initial spike. They held. That means traders with access to better information than the public are not pricing in de-escalation. Third, 2 Iranian fast attack vessels conducted an unannounced passage through a corridor in the northern Gulf that they have not used operationally since 2019. That corridor leads toward the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern chokepoint, the one the Houthis have already been partially interdicting since late 2023. If Iran coordinates direct IRGC naval presence with Houthi surface operations at Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously with any Hezbollah escalation in the north, you get a 3-point encirclement of the energy corridor that no single U.S. carrier group can answer, not because of American weakness, because of geometry. Here's the full picture. 17 drones was not a provocation. It was a calibration test. Iran needed to know 3 things: response time, rules of engagement, and whether the back-channel deal's collapse would trigger a kinetic reaction or a diplomatic one. They now have all 3 answers. Why did the USS Gerald Ford sit 400 miles away? Because someone in Washington made a deliberate choice to deny her on the escalation trigger it was also simultaneously testing for. The 90-day suspension is now off the table. Both sides know it. The Omani intermediaries have gone quiet. That silence is the loudest signal in the region right now. which leaves one loop still open, because here's what the oil market already understands and the news cycle hasn't caught up to yet. The next move doesn't come from Tehran or Washington. It comes from a third capital, one that has been watching this calibration test with far more strategic interest than either principal in the conflict. That capital's decision, expected within the next week, reshapes the entire board. That's the next chapter. And when it moves, you'll want to already understand why 17 drones on one quiet night in the Gulf was the opening move, not the provocation.